Hello, and welcome to this program on biblical principles about socialism. I will be your host for the program, Dr. Lee Watts. The first thing we're going to do is examine when people say there is biblical evidence to support socialism. Some people even go so far as to say that Jesus himself was a socialist. Well, as my mother was fond of saying, that just makes me sick, because nothing is further from the truth. They will cite things where Jesus said that we are to give to the poor, we are to take care of the sick, feed the hungry, pay your taxes. And yes, indeed, Jesus did say all of those things. However, when he said that, was he setting up a system where this is individual charity that we are supposed to carry out? Or is he saying this is supposed to be a system of forced compliance making you to do these things? Well, of course, the answer is he was telling us this is supposed to be our individual charity that you decide to do freely. If you force someone to give you a gift, well, then it really isn't a gift, is it? And that's one of the things that boils down between the difference between capitalism and socialism. In capitalism, the only time transactions take place is when both parties are willing. Someone is willing to pay, someone is willing to sell. But in socialism, the only way that it works is when it is forced or by coercion. If you are forced to give your money to the government so that they can redistribute it to others, and then you are threatened with the IRS or with a lot of lawyers and trials or jail time if you fail to comply. So the biblical evidence for this does not stand up whatsoever. Now, socialists are fond of saying that capitalists are greedy, selfish, immoral, power-hungry. They only want to help the rich and they want to hurt poor people. Well, let's examine if this is really true. What is more greedy than taking something from someone else? What is more selfish than taking for yourself what someone else has earned? What is more moral, to force someone to do something or for them to choose to do something voluntarily? Liberals are all the time saying that the rich and mega corporations are villains, and yet they seem to have a never-ending list of ideas of what to do with their money, which is what makes them villains. In a socialist society, things are not really owned, they are merely shared. So we have to ask ourselves a question: how much of your stuff do you deserve to keep, and how much should you have to give away to others? Now, the socialists love to say, well, we're taking the moral high ground here because we don't think it'd be fair for somebody to have nothing and for somebody else to have everything. And here is the major flaw in a liberal socialist philosophy. The philosophy is that one person has to be the loser in order for another person to be the winner. That is why they villainize the rich, because they're saying, because you are rich, that makes others poor. And that is the key flaw in the logic. Just because one person is getting rich does not mean someone else is getting poor. That would be a zero-sum system where there is zero new sums created. No new wealth is created, and that is the problem with the socialist philosophy. And the reason that it works in a zero-sum system is because you would have the people giving their wealth, their money, to the government, who then in turn gives the money to people either on food stamps or farm subsidies or bailing out businesses. By doing this, no new wealth is created. The wealth of the people is only consumed, and it is consumed by people who have done nothing to earn it. Those consuming the wealth have not done anything to serve their fellow man whatsoever. Now let's contrast this socialist zero-sum system where no new wealth is created, only consumed, and let's contrast that with a capitalist system. Well, first of all, in a capitalist system, that's a positive sum system where things are being created. First of all, you are working for others. By doing this, you are serving your fellow man by working for them. And then the work creates wealth for you and for them, because they get the benefit of your labor and you get the benefit of getting paid. So now we have wealth being created. Then you take the wealth that you have been paid and you go shopping, and now you're getting the benefit of the goods from other people, and the people you buy it from are also getting benefits from the effect of labor. And we see this as a positive growth system. American capitalism has created more wealth for more people than any other society in all of human history. Why would you want to change that for a system which has repeatedly failed throughout human history? In capitalism, wealth is created. In socialism, wealth is consumed, which is why countries who become profitable through capitalism and then slowly turn to socialism become very poor countries. Modern-day Venezuela is a perfect, sad example of this. Now let's go back to this moral high ground issue. Some people were saying, well, Jesus was a socialist. However, if we examine the teachings of Jesus, we will see that he does not teach socialism, but instead he teaches the principles of capitalism. In the book of Matthew, chapter number 25, is the parable of the talents. A talent is a unit of money. And Jesus tells a story of a man who had 3 people who worked for him. To the first and second person, he gave them 10 talents and then 5 talents. And then the third guy, he gave him 1 talent. Then he goes away, and the man comes back and says, "What did you 3 people do with the money?" Well, the first 2 people have gone out and have worked and invested, and they have turned a profit, and they have more money than the other guy. These guys are capitalists. In fact, they have doubled their money. Now, did Christ go to these 2 fellas and say, listen, it's not fair, especially you one that doubled it. You have 10 talents and now you've got 20? That's not fair. You've made the other guy poorer. So I'm going to take the extra from you because you don't need it, and I'm going to redistribute it equally between the 3 of you. Well, of course not. That's not what Christ said at all. To the 2 fellas who had turned a profit, who were capitalists, he said, "Well done, thou good and faithful servants." To the person who got a handout, did nothing to earn it, did no work, has nothing to show for it, Christ did not continue to give him any more. In fact, he took back what he had the first time and gave it to the guy who had made the most money, because he knows what to do with it. And if the business owner in the story says, listen, I want to give my money to somebody who knows how to earn money, then that would be a good biblical principle for capitalism for us to follow. This leads us to the story of America's first socialist. When the Pilgrims came over and settled in Jamestown, Virginia, in the years 1609 to 1610, it was what is called the starving time. And let me tell you the reason why. They had socialism. The whole community was set up in a socialist system. They would put all of their crops into one common storehouse, and then they would take from the storehouse food as they needed it. That was the slogan that Karl Marx would come up with about 200 years later, which is from each according to his ability to each according to his need. This is right out of the socialist communist playbook, literally. But the trouble was, a lot of people weren't interested in getting up early and working hard all day to raise crops. A lot of them wanted to go out and look for gold, and some of them would say, well, I got this excuse and that excuse. And the governor of the colony repeatedly commented in his journals how people had all kinds of excuses why they couldn't go work in the fields. And then the winter came, and there was not enough food. The vast majority of everyone died. They were forced to eat snakes and rats. One guy, the first public execution to happen in the colonies was because one guy survived the winter when it was discovered because he'd eaten his dead wife. And so here's a terrible problem, is that the people are starving to death, but no one was willing to work because they thought, well, I'll just get some stuff for free. It is socialism run rampant. At this time, gold has no value. Who cares about gold when you're starving to death? Food is wealth. And therefore we see the wealth has been consumed. So what happens? Well, we have Captain John Smith to the rescue. He had left the colony, had gone back to England because he was sick, and when he returns, he finds them in this terrible condition. So he says, we're not going to have this communal property anymore and this common storehouse, this socialism, communism. He divided up the land into individual lots. He's like, this is for you and this is for you, and whatever you raise, that's what you're going to eat and nothing else. He said, he who does not work does not eat. This is right out of the biblical principle in 2 Thessalonians 3:10, which says, he who would not work, neither should he eat. And we see here a biblical principle being put into use. So what happened the following year? There was a great abundance of food, a surplus in fact, and they had a great feast. So what happened? Socialism consumed all of the wealth, and the people died, and there was nothing there. So they switched to capitalism, and they were able to create great wealth. Another great example of how socialism consumes a culture, it does not prosper it. Now let's look at actually what is the exact definition of socialism. It is an ideology arguing that citizens are best served by policies focused on what is most beneficial for the entire society rather than most beneficial for the individual. This is the kind of philosophy that Adolf Hitler and the Nazis used in Germany in the 1930s. Hitler was fond of saying, society's needs come before the individual's needs. The whole term Nazi is a little abbreviation of the first two parts of the National Socialist German Workers' Party. You have national, and the first part of that is Na, and then socialist, Z, Na-Z. And that's where you get the term Nazi Party. It was a socialist party. Now, his quote from the 1930s is very similar to the quote from 2008 from presidential candidate Hillary Clinton when she said, we must stop thinking of the individual and start thinking about what is best for society. These are just two different forms of socialism. One is National Socialism, not Z again. The other is Democratic Socialism. Now, some people seem to think that Democratic Socialism is different from Socialism. It's just because it's different because they added the word Democrat in front of it. I mean, that's not the way it works. Just because you voted for something does not change what it is, nor does it change if that thing is inherently good or bad. We see that Adolf Hitler, he was what is called a fascist, and Hillary Clinton is a very outspoken, self-defined liberal. So we have to look now at what are the definitions of a fascist, a liberal, a socialist, and a Democrat. First of all, let's compare what is the difference between fascism and liberalism. And to do that, we're going to take a quick look at a clip from President Ronald Reagan.
Because how do we call a liberal? You know, someone very profoundly once said many years ago that if fascism ever comes to America, it'll come in the name of liberalism. And what is fascism? Fascism is private ownership, private enterprise, but total government control and regulation. Well, isn't this the liberal philosophy? The conservative, so-called, is the one that says less government, get off my back, get out of my pocket, and let me have more control of my own destiny.
So we see here that President Reagan is defining a fascist as really the same thing as a liberal. Both of them are seeking total government control. So we see fascism equals liberalism, but does liberalism equal socialism? To get the answer of that, we're going to go to Democratic Congresswoman Maxine Waters.
Guarantee to the American people, because of the inaction of the United States Congress, ever increasing prices unless the demand comes down, and the $5 will look like a very low price in the years to come if we are prohibited from finding new reserves, new opportunities to increase supplies.
And guess what this liberal would be all about? This liberal will be all about socializing, would be about basically taking over and the government running all of your companies.
And what is fascism? Fascism is private ownership, private enterprise, but total government control and regulation. Well, isn't this the liberal philosophy?
You'll notice there in the clip that she kind of stops and catches herself. She's like, oh, I just said that I wanted to have socialism. And then she goes on to say the very definition of it, which is the total government control over private industry, which is the definition also of fascism. These are different labels, and those in academia want to point out how, oh, a fascist is this, and a liberal is that, and the socialist is something else. They're all different labels, but they all seem to be getting toward the same end, which is total government control. So now let's talk about what is the difference between a fascist, liberal, socialist, and a member of the Democratic Party. And to get the answer, what's the difference between a Democrat and a socialist, we're going to look at a short interview from the former chairwoman of the Democratic National Committee.
The difference between us and the Republicans is that we really are a Big Tent party.
What is the difference between a Democrat and a socialist? I used to think there was a big difference. What do you think it is?
The difference between
a Democrat like Hillary Clinton and a socialist like Bernie Sanders.
What's the difference between being a Democrat and being a Republican?
Well, what's the bigger difference? What's the big difference between a Democrat and a socialist? You're the chairman of the Democratic Party. Tell me the difference between you and a socialist.
The relevant debate that we'll be having over the course of this campaign is what's the difference between a Democrat and a Republican?
You'll notice that she twice was asked what is the difference between a socialist and a Democrat, and both times she did not have an answer. Instead, she tried to change the question and say, well, really what you should be asking me is this. And the reporter said, no, I want you to tell me what is the difference. And you'll note she did not have a difference. Those aren't our words. Those are her own words or lack of them. So now let's talk about what is the difference between a socialist and a communist. Well, for that, let's look over to the quote from Ayn Rand. She was a Russian who became an American. She was a novelist and playwright and philosopher. She wrote the novel Atlas Shrugged, and which they later and most recently made into a movie. Notice what she said. Quote, there is no difference between communism and socialism except in the means of achieving the same ultimate end. Communism proposes to enslave men by force, socialism by vote. It is merely the difference between murder and suicide. End quote. This is what we were saying before. Those in academia are going to say, oh, well, there's a difference, and you obviously don't understand the difference. No, quite the reverse. I completely understand the technical definition differences, but when you come right down to it, they're all trying to accomplish the same exact goals. Now, this is someone who is speaking who is anti-socialism. But what about someone who is pro-socialism? How do they define socialism and communism's relationship? Well, let's look at this quote from Vladimir Lenin. He said, the goal of socialism is communism. I mean, you got a communist is just a socialist that has some patience. Let's look at another quote who's someone who is pro-communism, pro-socialism in their viewpoint. Karl Marx. He said socialism is a transitional social state between the overthrow of capitalism and the realization of communism. So you have both those who are against socialism and communism and those who are for socialism and communism saying the same thing. Socialism is just a step toward communism. And they got people on both sides are saying that. Now notice in Marx's quote, he said it's the state that's between the overthrow of capitalism. See, they're wanting to overthrow it, which leads us to a book that was written in 1958 called The Naked Communist, which is just exposing communism for what it is in the United States. In this book from the 50s, there are 54 stated goals of the Communist Party for how they intend to take over the government of the United States. For brevity's sake, we're only going to list one of the goals, but it sure is a scary read to read them all. One of their goals states, quote, capture one or both of the major political parties in the United States, end quote. Well, let's see how successful they've been in getting them to become communist or socialist. Which one of the political parties today supports socialized education, socialized health care, socialized oil industry, socialized housing, socialized welfare, socialized tuition, and socialized anything else you want to mention as well? Have they, in fact, by very definition, become the socialist party, therefore fulfilling the goals of the stated socialist communist goals in the 50s? Here's another communist quote from the 50s, from Nikita Khrushchev, who was leader of the Soviet Union in 1959. Notice what he said, quote, "Your children's children will live under communism. You Americans are so gullible. You won't accept communism outright, but we'll keep feeding you small doses of socialism until you will finally wake up and find that you already have communism. We won't have to fight you. We will so weaken your economy until you fall like overripe fruit into our hands." End quote. Now, notice several things he says here. He says, notice, we will keep feeding you socialism, as in it's already happening. We saw this was happening back under FDR and his New Deal socialism programs. And they were continuing to push socialism even at that day. And what is happening in the States now? We have increased socialism programs, and it is hurting the economy. And what has happened? The Russians and the Soviets are stepping right up, just as Khrushchev said was going to happen. Notice again about overthrowing capitalism. Notice the words of Adolf Hitler in the 30s, quote, "We are socialist. We are enemies of today's capitalistic economic system for the exploitation of the economically weak, with its unfair salaries, with its unseemly evaluation of a human being according to the wealth and property instead of responsibility and performance. And we are all determined to destroy this system under all conditions," end quote. You're going to see several of these same lines being spoken by liberal, Democrat, socialists today in the United States. We need to destroy this condition. We're going to be playing a clip for you from Bernie Sanders a little bit later about that. It's not fair. The wealthy are taking advantage. It's the same lines that have been used throughout all of history. Now let's talk about what is on the socialism agenda. What are they pushing? First of all, they want a higher minimum wage. There's a popular phrase, the fight for 15. Unemployment, they say, is too high for unskilled labor, so the way they're going to fix that is they're going to double the cost of hiring unskilled labor, which is absolutely insane. Let me give you an illustration on why this is a bad idea. Let's say that there's a kid who comes to mow your yard and says, "I will mow your yard for $10. So you pay the kid the $10. A few weeks later, he comes and says, "I'm going to have to increase my prices. I will mow your yard this week for $20. Well, you might go ahead and pay the $20. But then the kid comes back the next week and says, "Listen, I want to get me a nice car or something, so I'm now going to charge you $100 to mow your yard." Would you pay some kid $100 to mow your yard when you used to get it for $10 just a few weeks ago? Well, no, you're not going to. So what has happened? Because of the increased price, you are not hiring this person. A job has not been created. Well, why did you not pay this person? Are you greedy? Do you want him to fail? No, it has nothing to do with wanting the kid to fail. The reason you are unwilling to pay the $100 is the price of the service is not worth the price being charged. So what happens when someone has to pay higher wages? The cost will then be passed on to the customer, and then you will have inflation. So your $15 an hour is not going to be buying you really any more stuff than it bought you when you got started. And that is the problem with continually raising the minimum wage. One of the other things on the socialist agenda is free college tuition. Now, is it really free, or is somebody somewhere paying for it? I'll tell you this right now, somebody is actually footing the bill for all of this. If one kid goes to college for free and another kid can't go to college at first because he's got to work this nasty, hard job for a year or 2 or 3 to earn the money to go to school. And then they both go to school and there's a fraternity party. Which kid is going to be inclined to go to the party and which one is going to buckle down and do their studies? The kid who has invested nothing to get there, or the kid who has had to work to get there? Now, if taxpayers are picking up the tab, there is no incentives for the colleges and universities to keep costs down. This is also going to hurt small colleges, because if it is free, then I want to go to the big name school and have that on my diploma instead of some local smaller school. The colleges are going to have tons more students. They're going to need more dorms. So they're going to need more classrooms. They're going to need more labs. They're going to need more equipment. They're going to need tons of everything right away, and the cost of college educations will skyrocket. Not just high schoolers are going to be going into college, but really, if it's going to be free, you're going to have all kinds of people who want to go, or they're going to be filing age discrimination lawsuits. And if the government has to pay for college, then they are going to dictate how it's going to be run. So free college tuition, doesn't that just sound great on the surface? But when we take just even a small time to think about it, we see that would be all kinds of problems that would make it more expensive, not less. And then one of the other things on the socialist agenda is how entitlements become rights. What you are entitled to today, the next day you're saying, well, I have a right to this. And it really takes away from a gratitude attitude instead of it saying, well, how much more stuff can I get? I mean, you might be a socialist if you think the law of supply and demand is if you demand something of the government, then they should supply it. Another item on the socialist agenda is that the rich should have to pay their fair share of taxes. And don't we hear this one a lot. They're not paying their fair share. Well, let's think about how much are they actually paying. Out of all the personal income tax, how much should the top 10% of earners pay? If you're being fair about it, the top 10% of earners should pay 10% of the taxes. That would be their fair share. However, let's say we charge them double and they have to pay 20%. So that is double of their fair share. Would that then be fair? Should the top 10% have to pay 20%, 30%, or 50% of all taxes? Now, that wouldn't be very fair for them. However, that's not how much they actually pay. According to IRS data in 2012, the top 10% of earners pay more than 70% of all personal income taxes. 70% is paid by the top 10%. I think that's more than fair. And another item they want to hit is to defeat and to destroy the upper class. That's just what that quote from Adolf Hitler was talking about. And now to be successful is a crime. It's something they will villainize you for. How dare you be successful and have made some money? Instead of that being the goal in life, it has become something to be looked down upon. So it discourages work to earn more. And nothing really says, hey, I'm standing against greed, like demanding that somebody else pay for your free stuff. If it's wrong for the rich to have more money than the poor, then shouldn't there be a worldwide tax to redistribute money from rich countries to poor countries? So let me ask you a question. How much are you willing to pay? How much are you willing to send to the people in other countries who you don't know and never will know? 5% more taxes, 10%, 70%. If you earn $34,000 or more, then you are in the top 1% of earners in the entire world. You are the 1%. And according to the socialists, you should be taxed. 80% of your income should be sent to people in other countries. It boils down to this question: how much of your money do you deserve to keep? Now we're going to hear a clip from the Democratic Socialist candidate who ran for president back in 2016, Bernie Sanders.
Democratic socialism means that we must create an economy that works for all, not just the very wealthy. public education must today allow every person in this country the right to go to a public college or university tuition-free. Democratic socialism means that our government does everything it can to create a full employment economy, that we must raise the minimum wage to a living wage, that in a democratic, civilized society, the wealthiest people and the largest corporations must pay their fair share of taxes. It means that health care should be a right of all people, not a privilege. We need to develop a political movement which, once again, is prepared to take on and defeat a ruling class whose greed is destroying our nation.
You'll notice in Bernie's speeches, he was saying things that we have heard from Hillary Clinton and from Adolf Hitler and from the other socialist, liberalist, fascist groups throughout the entire program, and we've exposed the flaws in their logic. Now, let's hear some thoughts on socialism from some of the greatest people throughout history. We'll start with Winston Churchill. He said, quote, "Socialism is the philosophy of failure, the creed of ignorance, and the gospel of envy. Its inherent virtue is the equal sharing of misery." End quote. Socialism, what it does is it turns necessities into luxuries. Now, conversely, capitalism turns luxuries into necessities. In the States, if you don't have heat and air conditioning and a refrigerator, well, those are necessities, but those things are luxuries in other socialist countries. Well, let's hear some thoughts on socialism from a great American, former President Ronald Reagan. He said, "A socialist is someone who has read Lenin and Marx. An anti-socialist is someone who understands Lenin and Marx." I mean, after all, a socialist would have you pay your bills to the government instead of paying it to a private business owner. You buy your groceries from the government, you buy your car from the government, and everything else as well. Let's go back across the ocean to hear another British Prime Minister's thoughts on this. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. She said, "The problem of socialism is sooner or later you run out of other people's money." Wouldn't it be great if the Americans who are pushing for socialism actually had to go live in a socialist country? If you think about things going on in Venezuela, it used to be an incredibly prosperous country, and then within 17 years of voting in socialism, they have gone to complete economic collapse, where the people have broken into zoos to slaughter the animals to eat them because they're hungry. We have things in America that other people can only dream about. But those pushing socialism want us to be like the other countries who are dreaming and wishing that they could be like America. What an insane idea. Let's get one last thought from the great President Reagan. He said, "Socialism only works in two places. Heaven, where they don't need it, and hell, where they already have it." And before we sign off, let's hear some great quotes from President Reagan in his own words about the wonderful system of America and the great dangers of changing that to a socialist system.
I have spent most of my life as a Democrat. I recently have seen fit to follow another course. I believe that the issues confronting us cross party lines. Outside of its legitimate functions, government does nothing as well or as economically as the private sector of the economy. For 3 decades, we've sought to solve the problems of unemployment through government planning, and the more the plans fail, the more the planners plan. A government can't control the economy without controlling people, and they know when a government sets out to do that, it must use force and coercion to achieve its purpose. Somewhere a perversion has taken place. Our natural unalienable rights are now considered to be a dispensation of government, and freedom has never been so fragile, so close to slipping from our grasp as it is at this moment. In this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
This concludes this look into principles about socialism. I hope it has given you a better understanding of the topic and appreciation for being born into the American capitalist system. For more information on similar products, visit our website at godandcountryministry.com. That's godandcountryministry.com.